Okay, Nixukoix, ki esxnimatsix. Nistuamuk, otak kitopi, kiantoxisuko, kitayakustitsmatpoau, nitipox. Okay, my name is Kolton Running Crane, and today I'm going to be teaching you all some Blackfoot. So let's get started with Nitipoxen by me, Otak Kitopi, the Blackfoot language. Okay. So about Nisto, myself. Oknitaniku Otakhkitopi. My name is Otakhkitopi. It's got sim Kolton Running Crane. My English name is Kolton Running Crane. Gi Nideskanamat I teach Blackfoot language. Gi Nitstapotak Calgary language names. Working at Calgary language names. That's a little bit about me. And in this lesson, I'm simply going to give an introduction to the language, as well as pronunciation and the William Big Bull writing system, as well as a basic introduction to grammar. So let's get started. First off, we're going to do an introduction to the language. And so with the Blackfoot language speakers, there are only about 5,000 speakers split across 4 bands of Blackfoot. There's the Gana band, Siksika, Pikani, and Amskapi Pikani. Gana, Siksika, and Pikani are in Canada, in southern Alberta. And Amskapi Pikani is down here in Montana, in the United States. And each band speaks a different dialect. There's the Gana dialect, Siksika dialect, Pikani dialect, and Amskapi Pikani dialect. And although there are several dialects within each dialect, for instance, in Amskapi Pikani, there are multiple dialects across the reservation, but each band is classified as its own dialect. And there is no standardized writing system. There's no one way that we write. There are many different ways that we can write. We have multiple writing systems that are very popular amongst speakers. A lot of people just write it phonetically, so they write it how it sounds to them. And some people use the phonetic system, but we in this class will use the William Big Bull writing system, and so on and so forth. With the different dialects, continuing on with the dialects, as I've said, each band speaks a slightly different dialect. The Gana dialect has the most speakers, and oftentimes Gana is kind of looked at as the standard Blackfoot. And most similar to each other is Northern and Southern Piegan, or Apatsi Pigani and Amskapi Pigani. The reason for that is because it's the same band, same dialect, but it was split by the United States-Canadian border over 100 years ago, and that split has created kind of an isolation between the two groups, so they kind of developed their own dialects, which are a little distinct from each other, but they're still very similar. And in these classes, we are going to be using the Southern Piegan dialect, Skapi Kani. Okay, so first we'll start with the William Big Bull writing system. That's the first part of the lesson. So within the William Big Bull writing system, some of you may have seen it before. It's mostly used in Amskapi Pikani. I have not really seen it used in Siksika or Gane, but it was developed in Apatsi Pikani, but it's used most in Amskapi Pikani. And it's a Latin-based alphabet, just with different diacritics, which tell you how the different letters are pronounced. And so our first kind of symbol, I guess we could call it, is this V, which is on top of the letters. and we call that the stabs on top. Next one is this flat symbol on top of the letters, and that's the lays on top. Next, we have the single dot on top of the letters, and so we call it the dot on top. And so let's get started with each of the letters. So the first one, and I should mention this, most of the William Bigville writing system, the only thing that it really changes is the vowels. And so most of the consonants are going to be the same, except for a handful. So our first vowel is the A with the stabs on top, and it's pronounced ah, as in father, dog, or law, or even pronounced ah. Next is kind of an elongated and it's two A's with the stabs on top, and it's pronounced ah, ah, ah. And also means yes. And so if you hear that, it's meaning yes. But this symbol we pronounce ah. The next one is two A's with the lays on top, and it's pronounced ah, ah, ah. Pronounced candy, fan, or land. And before we go any further, I'd like to point out that the reason that we are starting with pronunciation and spelling rather than common greetings is because it's good to be familiar with the sounds of the language. That's the first step to learning the language, is learning the sounds. And although so far all of these sounds are in English, none of them are really that foreign until we get further. It's good because we write them different. And so it's important to be familiar with our different writing system. That way you don't become confused when you see long words written with these symbols. But yeah, as in candy, fan, or land. Next is a, and that's pronounced, and that's written with ay or ai. A, as in the word say, way, or pain. A. Next up is two I's, and that's pronounced E. 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 For instance, in C, east, or clean. E. And this symbol is very similar to the pronunciation of the last symbol, the two I's. These are two I's with the lays on top, and we call it the hard E. And really the difference is that you're adding emphasis to the sound. So you're saying E, E. You're kind of making a faster sound, you use faster breath, E. Or you could even, sometimes I'll pronounce it with a higher pitch, like E, E, E. Yeah, E versus E. E versus E. Next up is I with the lays on top and Y, and that's pronounced I, I, as in cry, I. Next is the A with the lays on top and an I, and we pronounce that eh, as in pen, let, or test, eh. Next one is the singular I, and that's pronounced I, such as it, sit, or pin, I. Next is the soft E, and this sound is kind of like a soft mixed with an I. So it's kind of like eh, eh. This is a sound hard to make by its own, but we use it in a word like gen. So you can hear that vowel in the word gen, which means the end. You can hear how it's pronounced gen. Next up is the O with the lays on top, and that's pronounced O, 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 as in bowl, soul, or goal, O, O, and yeah, O. Next up is oo, 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 and we pronounce that like in the word shoe, who, or two, and we just write it with two O's with the lays on top. Ooh, ooh. Next up is the O with the stabs on top, and that's pronounced uh, uh, as in book, put, or soot. Uh, uh. Next is the U with the stabs on top, and that's pronounced like gun, honey, or sun. And a lot of people mix it up with the A with the stabs on top, which we can remember as being pronounced as ah. So that would be ah, this would be ah. Another common mistake that I see with this symbol is a lot of people pronounce it as ooh, which is a understandable mistake because a lot of other languages with their U, they pronounce it ooh. But in Blackfoot, we pronounce it ah, ah, ah. Next up is the two O's with the stabs on top. And that's pronounced kind of like a mixture of and like Um, a word that we see this in is otsqui, which means blue, otsqui. This next symbol is just a simple dot, and it's called the glottal stop. And all that is a brief pause in pronunciation. A word that we see this in is ni. So you could kind of hear that pause between e and ni. Ni, ni, which means buffalo. Ni. So that's the glottal stop. We also see it in English. A lot of dialects, for instance, of English, pronounce the word button. They don't really pronounce the t. They say button, button. So if you can hear that stop in some of your words in English, that's the glottal stop. But in Blackfoot, if you want to use a word, you could use ni, which is buffalo. The next one is kind of a quotation mark. It's two hashes, and we call it the guttural, and it's pronounced in the back of the throat, as in ach, ach, ach. We don't have this sound in English, but you could kind of think of it as like a term of how we show disgust in English. Ach, ach. You're kind of sighing. Ach. It is a rather soft sound. You're not trying to like cough out a lung. You're not saying ugh. You know, a lot of people think that it's kind of like imagine you have popcorn in your throat, but it's not that rough. It's not raspy. It's just a simple ugh, ugh. The next one is the single mark, which we call the aspirate tone, and we can make this with parentheses, not the parentheses, the kind of just a punctuation mark. And it pronounces a hiss sound. For instance, ish, ish, ish. If you need help with this sound, you can imagine the sh sound in English, but with a space between your teeth. So you could keep a space between your teeth and make the sh sound, as in you're saying shush, ish, ish, ish. Could almost imagine it as a cat whisper as well. Ish. Another way that we use this as a tonal shift, and we use it after O's, and it adds emphasis to the O. So if you have a normal O without it, it just becomes O, O. But if we add the tonal shift after the O, it becomes like O, O, O. You add more emphasis and you drop your tone. This aspirate tone only comes after e's, and after e's it's pronounced ish. When the mark comes after an o, it becomes a tonal shift. It becomes o, o. And that was it for our vowels. Now it is time for the consonants. This is where we use the dot on top. For instance, the K with the dot on top we pronounce as ga, 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 as in sky, skin, or ski. Next up is the T with the dot on top. We pronounce da, 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 as in stop, stall, or stand. Next is the P with the dot on top, pronounced ba, 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 as in spy, spot, or spit. And notice with all three of these examples, they come in S words. And the reason for this is when we have an S first, we don't make that breath of air after the K. We're not saying sky, we're not saying skin or ski, we're not saying stop, stand, stall, spy, spot, spit, because we don't pronounce the P in Blackfeet as we do in English most of the time, or the K or the T. When we pronounce these in English, we have an air at the end of it. You know, if we were to say kai, kin, or ki, top, tall, or tanned, it has that t, versus the duh, which we use in Blackfoot. We don't say pie, pot, or pit. We say ba, ba. And so a good way to see this, if you're pronouncing it correctly in Blackfoot, is to kind of hold your hand in front of your face and say ba, ba, da, da, or ga, ga. You won't feel any air, versus if you're to say ka, ka, ta, ta, or pa, pa, which produces a lot of air. You could also use like a sticky note or just any piece of paper in front of your mouth. And if it moves, you're pronouncing it wrong because you're not supposed to have that puff of air in Blackfoot when you pronounce these three letters. However, we do have that puff of air that I was just talking about when we don't have the dot on top and when we have the mark at the end of it. And we only really see this at the end of words. And all it is kind of an emphasis. Whereas this would be ga, this would be like ik, it, or ip. So we pronounce these three letters normally when it comes at the end of the sentence. The next one is if we have double consonants. These following 5 consonants we pronounce a little bit differently when they're doubled up. For instance, 2 M's, 2 N's, 2 T's, 2 K's, or 2 S's. The way that we pronounce it is we add emphasis on the vowel that comes before, and we kind of elongate the sound. For instance, we wouldn't pronounce this im, as if it only had 1 M. We'd pronounce it im. But since it has 2 M's, we pronounce it im, im, im. Notice how I emphasize the I, and I elongate this sound, im. And I wouldn't pronounce this on, as if it only had 1 N. I'd pronounce it on, on, on. I had emphasis on the O, and I lengthen out these sounds, on. This one, at, at, versus if I were to just say at. With 2 T's, it becomes at. We add emphasis and then elongate. This would be ik, like in the way ik, gi, or I can't think of a word off the top of my head, but like ik. We add emphasis and elongate, ik. Versus if we just have 1 N, we just pronounce it ik or at, but they become at and ik. Or this one, we'd say S. And most of the time, it's not going to matter too much if you don't follow these double consonant rules, because it'll sound, the word will stay the same. It just won't sound natural. But however, sometimes there will be times if you don't elongate the S, it will change meaning. And so sometimes it can be important. For instance, if I said esugapsi with one S, esugapsi, it would mean she is good. But if I said esugapsi, it means she is heavy. Esugapsi. So sometimes this can change the meaning. Other sounds that are common is TS and KS. We have ts and x, ts and x. And it is important to get these sounds down because we use them a lot in Blackfoot. A couple words that we could use them in is tsa, tsa, because you can practice saying it at the beginning, tsa, or even it's t, because you can pronounce saying it in the middle, it's t. And these sounds aren't unfamiliar to an English speaker because we have them in words such as bots, sits, or hats. So we have these sounds, but the thing is, we're used to them being at the end. Bots, sits, hats. So what throws off people when they learn Blackfeet is that it comes up in different spots. So we have tsa or it's tsi. Okay. Same thing with KS. We have it in words like box, locks, or fix. But we never have KX sound at the beginning in English. So this word is rather difficult for a lot of people. But it's pronounced xisksteki, xisksteki. And this is an excellent word to use to practice, the KS sound. Xisksteki. And so if you just keep saying these words over and over, just pronouncing them gets more, it just becomes more easy, becomes easier. Because you get familiar with saying the words versus just saying it all at once. Xisksteki to a beginner would be very difficult. Xisksteki. But if they were to say it over and over and over again, all of the sounds become familiar and they don't get thrown off anymore. Xisksteki. And so these are all of the sounds that we use in the William Big Bull writing system. Mainly these ones, but these are just kind of important notes that we use in pronunciation. Not so much spelling system, but just pronunciation. These are kind of the more difficult words to pronounce. Sounds. Tsa and it's ti and xisksteki have sounds that don't really appear in English the way that they do in these words. But yeah, if we could master these words, then all of the other sounds, the strange sounds with isks or its, they become exponentially easier to pronounce and less challenging, less formidable. And so now we'll look at the grammar of Blackfoot, simple grammar, just to give a sort of introduction to how the language works. And so all of these words that I will use, might confuse you, but if you've learned languages in the past, these words will look familiar. But if you haven't learned a language in the past, then you could still stick along and you still learn about how Blackfoot works. So within Blackfoot, we have a loose word order. And what that means is the way that we put words together doesn't matter as much as it would in English. So if I were to say a sentence such as, the dog eats the apple in Blackfoot, in English, it has to be that way. The dog comes first, eats second, the apple next. That's how it has to be, otherwise it won't make sense. It won't make sense if I say, an apple the dog eats. But in Blackfoot, we can do that. We can mix up all those aspects together. So we could say, emeta, Owatum apestaminatsi. Imitawatum apestaminatsi. A dog eats an apple. But we could also say apestaminatsi imitawatum. An apple the dog eats. We can mix things around and it doesn't really change the meaning of the sentence because we still have context. We could also say apestaminam owatum imita. An apple eats the dog, but that doesn't really mean an apple is eating the dog. We can get that from the context and also the grammar of the words. For instance, owatum, it means eat, but it's talking about eating something inanimate. And since a dog is alive, it wouldn't make sense to say that the apple is eating the dog. And so from context, we can kind of get the meaning that the dog is eating the apple, no matter what way we put the word. And this kind of works with all sentences. You could put the words in any order, generally any order that you'd like, and the meaning will stay the same. In more complicated sentences, the meaning might become ambiguous, but generally you can tell by context because context is very important in Blackfoot. And as I've said, the word order doesn't affect much. So we could have our subject, which is the one acting, our verb, which is our action, or we could have our verb first, the action coming first, and then our subject. For instance, we could say, "Oma imita oxkasio." That dog is running. Or I could say, Oxkasio, oma imita. Running is that dog. Both mean the dog is running in English, but we can mix it up and it doesn't change the meaning. Or if we're acting on an object, we could also change it. Subject plus verb plus object is one way, as in someone that's acting, this is what they're doing, and this is who they're acting on. We could also do who they're acting on, the person that's doing the acting, and then the verb or any other order that you could put that in. For instance, I could say nitsitsip sata ninna or nitsitsip sata oma ninna. I spoke to that man. You have I spoke first. That man, kind of object. Or we could say ninna nitsitsip oma ninna nitsitsip sata. That man I spoke to. That wouldn't really make sense in English, but we can say that in Blackfoot. Another thing that I hear people asking me about is the length of words in Blackfoot, because Blackfoot words are infamously long. You know, most of the words are way longer than English words. And so let's break apart the length. Why is it so long? And let's look at the different parts of the word. For instance, let's take this word. This is way longer than any word that we'd see in English, but it's not that bad in terms of Blackfoot words. Nedako matapoch pennan. Nedako matapoch pennan. We will leave. We're going to head out. Nedako matapoch pennan. Although this might look very challenging, very intimidating for an English speaker, it's not that long or difficult when you break it apart. And so the different colored parts correspond to these meanings in English. So the red parts, nit at the beginning and och binan at the end, mean we. And then we have our verb in our descriptor in the middle. Ak means will. It's going to happen in the future. And then our verb, omatapu. Omatapu means to leave, to head out, to go, to get going. And so, nidako matapoch penan really is, I guess you could look at it as 4 different words. But the reason that we don't write them separately is because they relate to each other. You can't have och binan without nit. and you can't have ak without omatapu. It just wouldn't make sense to separate all of these words. And so we write them as one long word. And another reason for this is if we split them up as separate words, the pronunciation would change because we are pronouncing it as a singular unit. We're saying we're not saying nit ak omatapo auch binan. That's not how we're pronouncing it. We're saying nitakomatapo binan. So for that reason, we don't have any of these spaces and we treat it as one singular word. And so generally we can break all kind of sentence words. I guess you could call this a sentence word because it is an English sentence put into one Blackfoot word. So with our sentence word, it's broken down into these 4 parts. We have our pronoun, which tells us who is doing something. We have our prefix, which is generally going to tell us when something's going to happen or how something's going to happen. You could have, this is where we put words like good or bad or not, fast, slow, even the word will. And then we have our and then we have the verb, which tells us the action that's going on. And then our suffix. We could put a lot for the suffixes. The suffixes can really change a lot. For instance, if I took out this ochbenan, I just get nidakomatapu, which just means I will leave. And so this ochbenan changes it to we will leave. And more about the pronoun, this nit makes it so that it's talking about the first person, this sentence. So a pronoun is the first part of our verbal sentences, tells us who. Here are our pronouns. We have nit, which is I, get, you, and then sometimes we have ot. Depends on what we're saying, but generally we don't use it, and that tells us he or she. For instance, nitsitapu. This is an instance of where the pronoun will change it. Nitsitapu. I go, I went. Gitsitapu. You go, you went. Or just itapu. He or she goes, or he or she went. Our prefix we can generally have in the adverb, the verb tense, and then these words, then, there, when, or where. So for instance, our adverbs we can have mat, gum, or suk, which means not, fast, and good, respectively. For instance, we could say nitsuk sok, I slept well, or I slept good. And with our verbs, there are the main action words of the sentence, and there are 4 different kinds of verbs. We have VAI, which is verb animate intransitive. VTA, which is verb transitive animate. VII, which is verb inanimate intransitive. And VTI, verb transitive inanimate. So what do these words mean? Well, let's go into it. So VAI is really, it's a verb that living things do, hence the word animate, but it's intransitive, meaning that it's not acting on anything. It doesn't need anything to do this verb. Since apotake, which means to work, or we have oyi, to eat. VTA, which is verb transitive animate, we have acting on an animate thing. Transitive means it's acting on something animate, something alive. Sitsipsat, to talk to, as in to talk to something that's alive. Or inno, which means to see someone that's alive. VII is verbs that inanimate things are doing and not acting on anything else. For instance, it's ti, to be, or istoi, to be cold. So I could, for instance, say estoi, it's cold. It's cold out. VTI, Transitive, inanimate. You're acting on something that's not alive. So we have inni, which means to see something, something not alive. Or we have xini, which means to touch something. And these are just examples. And the next part of our length of words is our suffix. And our suffix can make the word plural or singular, but there are many other uses. There's not really any way that you could simplify what the suffix does to the word, because there are many things that it can do. But the main way that it changes it is determining if it's plural or singular. For instance, nitsita pu, I go, versus nitsita poch pinan, we go. And that's it. Ganye, the end of today's lesson. So I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and be on the lookout for more to come and for worksheets for this lesson. But anyway, kita matsun. Wow. I'll see you all later.